Hi, I'm Heidi Horvick, and welcome to this class in the Research Methodology for Chiropractors course. So in today's class, we're going to be covering ethics and research constraints. So why we bother with ethical issues in research experiments and how this influences or constrains the types of experiments that get done. So I'll cover a little bit of the history of why we look at ethics when it comes to research experiments and how that has evolved over time. So first of all, I'm going to start with why we need to be concerned about ethics in research, and then look at a very, very brief history of ethics in research. And we'll pay some attention to some key world-agreed standards in research ethics, such as the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki. They are two key world agreements that were made, and the Declaration of Helsinki still influences research experiments today all around the world. I'll also look at some key experiments or examples of how these ethical principles were broken. Even after the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki came into place, there's some very well-known examples that breached these agreed standards. So we'll briefly go over these examples that breached ethics standards and specifically talk about what the guiding principles of ethics in research are and why we adhere to them. And then I'm going to just finish off discussing the role of research committees or institutional review boards, which is another name for them in different countries. So these three books have got some good chapters on ethical issues in research. And just as a note, the first book there, edited by Pajot, the 2017 book, An Introduction to Research Methods, a hands-on approach, it raises ethical issues in every single chapter, so it's kind of spread throughout the book. But the other two book references, they have distinct chapters covering ethics and research. I've also included quite a few original research articles for you on this topic. Some of the articles are really good, like, for example, the Goodwin's article on vulnerable subjects, Why Does Informed Consent Matter? Others are key papers that talk about some of these breaches of ethics, these classical ones like the Tuskegee syphilis study, and it's a research article about that. So if you wanted to learn a little bit more about some of these classic cases in history that breached ethical standards and why that matters so much, I've given you some individual references for it as well, so you can follow up on basically the topic that I'm discussing. There's also some really cool papers on the Nuremberg Code or the Declaration of Helsinki, so again, I wanted you to have those original references. And on the second slide, there's just more examples of some of these breaches, like the Milgram study and so on, so they cover it in greater detail than what I go into in this class. So let's start with the first key question. Why do we even need to consider ethical issues in research experiments? Well, the answer is very simple. We need to protect people like this, the actual volunteers, the research participants. You would think researchers are smart people, but they can get a little carried away. And that's where we need to have ethical rules around what is allowed and what isn't allowed. So when the goals of research are designed to make major contributions to a particular field, such as improving our understanding of a disease process or determining the efficacy of an intervention, for example, like chiropractors, investigators or the researchers themselves may perceive the outcomes of their studies to be more important than providing protection for individual participants. Researchers can get carried away. They're human beings. So although discovering new scientific knowledge is really awesome and important, our society values the rights and the welfare of individuals. It's not basically considered ethical behavior to use individuals just as a means to an end, as a means to end to get new knowledge. That's not acceptable. The actual individual needs to be protected, the volunteer. So there are a range of ethical and social responsibilities and regulatory compliance issues that can impact a research project. And we bundle them all under the heading of ethics. So when I talk about ethics, I'm talking about all of this, the ethical issues, the social responsibilities, regulatory compliance issues, legal issues that impact on a research project. So ethics identifies moral principles that researchers need to be aware of when conducting research. And at any time, a researcher is working with many stakeholder groups that can include the participants, but it can also include other researchers in their team. They may have supervisors, they may be students, the organization that they represent, could be a client, the community at large, and so on. So there are many stakeholders for any particular research experiment. So these ethical laws and rules and standards are taking into account all the stakeholders, not just the research participants or the researchers themselves, all these others that this research project influences. So all these groups have rights, and frequently these rights can actually conflict with each other. And that's why, again, we have these ethical rules in place. So some ethical issues could even have legal implications. So, for example, respecting the privacy of participants is both an ethical issue and a regulatory requirement by law in many countries. So that will, again, influence the depth and the range of the study and the methods that is used, and the disclosure of information. So all of these things need to be taken into account, and often they fall under the umbrella of ethics, and each country then takes into account the laws of that country as well as it comes to, for example, privacy. Confidentiality is another issue that needs to be considered. It's also required by the Privacy Act in various countries, and this can pose problems if a researcher observes or learns about unlawful activity while undertaking a research experiment. So there's lots of different factors that get taken into account. Now, consent to participate in a research project is also extremely important. So consent must always be gained from the participants, and where participants cannot give consent themselves, then by a guardian or the power of attorney must give consent to participate in a research experiment. It's also extremely important that no participant is placed in a position where they may sustain harm. So sometimes healthcare techniques can only be tested on humans. For example, if we wanted to test the efficacy of chiropractic care, we also need to consider, well, could this study, or providing chiropractic care potentially harm people? Is that possible? And if so, at what rate is that possible? And you need to disclose that. And, if that harm is significant in any way, then how do you get around that? Again, this becomes an ethical issue. So when we fill out ethics applications to get ethical approval to do a study, all of these issues are always considered. Being truthful and not practicing any form of deception is another very important ethical issue that is considered in all research experiments. And this is obviously very important, for that research study to be viewed with any kind of integrity. But sometimes it's actually important that the research participants don't fully know what we are testing. So again, how do you get around that? And that's why it becomes an ethical issue, to make sure that if we are withholding the real reason or the real thing that we are testing, that isn't harmful for the participant themselves. And I'll share with you an example where that kind of deception was harmful. And so just to get an idea of what these ethical issues are. There's also a whole host of social and cultural sensitivities that are required of the researchers so that participants and other stakeholders are not discriminated against or shown any intolerance or bias for any reason, such as like gender, age, culture, religion, class, sexuality, or physical attributes of any kind. So in today's class, we're going to cover in a little bit more detail why we need to be concerned with all of these ethical issues in research. But to set the scene to begin with, let's take a brief look at the history of ethics in research. Now, prior to World War II, there was very little concern with the treatment of human subjects or participants in research experiments. So prior to World War II, there was no formal protection of research experiments. But then World War II happened, and in the aftermath, the world became witness to some atrocious medical experiments that had taken place in several of the Nazi concentration camps using non-consenting, usually Jewish inmates, including children and pregnant women. And there were all kinds of horrific experiments that took place. So, for example, at Dachau, a concentration camp in Germany, physicians from the German Air Force and from the German Experimental Institution for Aviation conducted high-altitude experiments on prisoners to determine the maximum altitude for which their crew could parachute to safety. So they literally threw prisoners out of aircrafts at various altitudes to see who would survive and who wouldn't. They also carried out notorious freezing experiments on prisoners in Dachau to find out, again, if there were any effective treatments for hypothermia, literally testing how long prisoners, non-volunteering, and again, usually Jewish prisoners, could survive in freezing water with various so-called treatments. Prisoners were also used to test various methods of making seawater drinkable. There's obvious issues with this, and as the world started to see these experiments, there was a lot of concern, naturally, about these practices. Other experiments that were done, for example, to develop and test drugs on various treatment methods for injuries and illnesses, which the German military and their occupation personnel encountered in the field. So again, for example, in concentration camps like Sachsenhausen, Dachau, Naschweiler, Buchenwald, and Neurongamme, scientists used camp inmates to test immunization compounds and antibodies for the prevention and treatment of contagious diseases, including malaria, typhus, tuberculosis, typhoid fever, yellow fever, and infectious hepatitis. So there were some horrific experiments. It also came to light that physicians in Ravensbrück conducted experiments in both bone grafting and tested newly developed sulfur drugs. In other concentration camps, prisoners were exposed to phosgenes and mustard gas in order to test again possible antidotes. And then there were the infamous twin experiments conducted by Joseph Mengele at Auschwitz. And these medical experiments sought to advance the racial ideological tenets of the Nazi worldview. So they literally wanted to breed more ideal blonde, blue-eyed Aryans. And he also used twins to explore various illnesses and human endurance. So Mengele usually used one twin as a control and subjected the other twin to everything from blood transfusions to forced insemination to injections with diseases and amputations. So then when one twin died, they were both killed and dissected. Well, the other twin was killed, and they were both dissected and studied to see what differences were occurring within the twin that they had experimented on versus the other twin that then was the control. So in the aftermath of the Second World War, when these types of horrific, cruel Nazi experiments came to light, many of the German physicians who carried out euthanasia and conducted medical experiments in Nazi death camps were tried in the Nuremberg trials in 1946 during like a 140-day-long trial. So the trial then resulted in 7 death sentences and also resulted in the Nuremberg Code. And that was the first time ever that there were these ethical standards established to control experimentation and protecting the subject. So this Nuremberg Code laid down 10 standards that had to be adhered to by any researcher doing experiments with human beings. So this code was a direct result of the war crimes conducted by the doctors on these concentration camp prisoners who died or were permanently affected as a result of the experiments that they underwent in a non-volunteering way. There are many witness testimonies of some of these horrific experiments from some of the few survivors. I've actually watched many of these first-hand survival accounts. They are available. They're not easy listening, so I'll warn you if you do want to listen to some of these. So here are the 10 standards that were laid down or agreed upon in the Nuremberg Code. Number 1, volunteers have to freely consent to participate. You can't force a participant to be part of a study. Number 2, researchers have to fully inform the volunteers concerning the study. So you have to fully inform them, and then the volunteer gets to choose to be part of it or not. Risks associated with a study must be reduced where possible. So basically, don't do a study when you know that it's going to result in death, right? That would completely breach this point number 3. Standard or code number 4, researchers are responsible for protecting participants against even remote harm. So this is something that researchers have to think about and be aware of. Point number 5, or code number 5, participants can withdraw from the study at any time. So if a participant changes their mind, they're free to leave the study or the study stops. Number 6, qualified researchers have to conduct the study. Because if you're not qualified, you're basically wasting everybody's time, because you may not be conducting the study properly, might not get published, in which case it's a waste of everyone's time. Code number 7, cessation of the study if adverse effects emerge. So basically you've got to stop the study if adverse events start to happen. You're not allowed to continue with the study. Code number 8, society should benefit from study findings. So we don't want to do a study that society doesn't benefit from. And this is, again, something that really does need to be considered. It might be interesting to the researcher, but unless this study can in some vague way end up benefiting society, again, you shouldn't be wasting people's time or any money on a study that doesn't benefit society. Code number 9 is that research on humans should be based on previous animal or other previous work. So if possible, first do experiments in animals before studies are then conducted in humans. And code number 10, a research study should never begin if there is reason to believe that death or injury may result. So some of them overlap a little bit, but they're 10 key straightforward points that everybody agreed then when they decided on this Nuremberg Code in 1946. So we're going to go on now and have a look at what's happened since the Nuremberg Code. But before we do that, just test yourself and make sure that you're picking up on the key content that we've covered so far.